A shocking discovery by the lake. It was a warm August morning in 2006, and the serenity of the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri typically meant nothing more than the sound of rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the gentle lapping of waves along the shores of the lake. For decades, locals had cherished this area as a slice of untamed Americana where families came to fish, hike, or camp under starry skies. But that peaceful morning would be shattered by a discovery so horrifying that the shadow of its mystery would haunt the community for years to come. Paul Hendricks, a middle-aged fisherman who often visited the lake to escape the grind of his job as a truck driver, was the one to unearth the grim secret. Maneuvering through the tall brush near the shoreline, Paul spotted what he first assumed to be an abandoned piece of luggage, a tattered black suitcase, partially submerged where the waterline met the muddy earth. It was odd finding something like that out here, in a place so remote. As curious as he was cautious, Paul poked the suitcase with his fishing rod, causing it to shift slightly in the water. Something about its weight seemed unnatural, as though it were eerily heavy for a suitcase of its size. "Now who would leave this all the way out here?" Paul muttered under his breath. With furrowed brows he leaned in closer, his better judgment warring with his insatiable curiosity. The corner of the suitcase had begun to fray, revealing a glimpse of a dark, wet cloth. Paul reached for the zipper, which was rusted and barely functional, giving him trouble as he forced it open. The moment it did, a nauseating smell escaped into the summer air, rancid and suffocating. Paul instinctively took a step back, covering his nose with one arm. "Something ain't right here." His voice trailed off as he forced himself to look inside. What met his gaze was not clothing, tools, or forgotten travel items. Inside the suitcase were what appeared to be human remains, clearly dismembered and wrapped haphazardly in what looked like duct tape and plastic bags. For a moment, Paul stood there frozen, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. His mind raced, trying to process how something so grotesque could end up here, in this quiet corner of the forest. He stumbled backward, fishing rod clattering to the ground, and scrambled to pull out his cell phone. His trembling hands made dialing difficult, but he managed to call 911. Gasping, he stammered to the dispatcher, You need to send someone to Mark Twain Lake right now. There's a suitcase, and there's human body parts in it." The 911 line crackled with the dispatcher's attempts to calm him down and get coordinates, but Paul could barely form coherent sentences. Beads of sweat rolled down his face despite the gentle breeze that swept through the trees. He dropped to his knees by the water's edge, staring at the suitcase in disbelief, as though it were some surreal nightmare he couldn't wake from. The chirping of the birds had ceased, every sound from nature seeming to hold its breath in eerie stillness. 20 minutes later, the quiet forest was disrupted by the arrival of two sheriff's patrol cars. Deputy Claire Rogers, a steady and seasoned officer of Boone County, was the first to approach the scene. She knew Paul as a regular fisherman in these parts, but even in her years of law enforcement she hadn't seen him this visibly shaken. As he guided her to the suitcase, he seemed to replay his discovery over and over in his head, as if trying to convince himself that it was real. "Right there, by the edge," he said, pointing. "I didn't touch anything, just opened it." Deputy Rogers crouched carefully, her gloved hands nudging the lid open just enough to confirm Paul's horrific claim. Striving to maintain her composure, she reached for the radio strapped to her shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Rogers. I'm gonna need backup and forensics at Mark Twain Lake. We've got human remains here, likely dismembered. Over." Within the hour, the small parking area near the lake was crawling with law enforcement, yellow crime scene tape encircling the area like a grim beacon for tragedy. Helicopters circled overhead, filming the unfolding chaos, and reporters began trickling in, their cameras hungry for a headline. Sheriff Doug Mathis soon arrived at the scene, his tall, imposing figure a stark contrast to the quiet, picturesque backdrop of the forest. As he surveyed the suitcase and its ghastly contents, his heart sank. He knew that something this brutal wasn't the work of an amateur. This wasn't an accident or a spontaneous act of violence. This was calculated, methodical, and chillingly remorseless. And now, it was his town's nightmare. "This is going to be a hell of an investigation," he muttered to one of his deputies. The medical examiner's van pulled up shortly afterward, and the slow, delicate process of recovering the remains began. Each part was carefully bagged and transported back to the forensic lab in Jefferson City, where they hoped science could offer answers that the naked eye couldn't. By the late afternoon, the lake's once tranquil environment had transformed into a crime scene swarming with detectives, officials, and curious onlookers beyond the police perimeter. Despite the chaos, one question dominated everyone's thoughts. Who was the victim, and how did they end up like this? In the small, tightly knit communities around the Mark Twain National Forest, this kind of crime was unheard of. Whispers spread quickly, from the gas stations to the hardware stores, from the diners to the churches. For the first time in years, the community felt an unsettling vulnerability, like innocence had been stripped away from their backyard. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows over the lake, the suitcase was gone, but the unspoken dread it left behind lingered in the humid summer air. What Paul Hendricks had stumbled upon wasn't just a horrific crime, it was the beginning of a wider, darker mystery, one that would take years to unravel. Identifying the victim and the preliminary investigation. By the time the crime scene was fully processed, local authorities had more questions than answers. All they had was a battered suitcase filled with dismembered human remains, and the overwhelming stench of death. No wallet, no identification, no personal belongings. Just the grisly evidence of a life brutally taken. It was as if the victim had been reduced to nothing more than a puzzle waiting to be pieced together. Sheriff Doug Mathis stood near the tape-marked perimeter of the scene, his arms crossed tightly against his chest as he stared out at the still waters of Mark Twain Lake. The sunlight glistened on the surface, creating an almost serene picture that clashed starkly with the horror of what they'd found just hours earlier. Nearby, Deputy Claire Rogers was taking down notes, her demeanor calm but tightly wound, like a coiled spring. "What do we know so far?" Mathis asked, finally breaking the silence. Rogers sighed, flipping through her small notebook. "Not much, Sheriff. Male victim, Caucasian based on preliminary observations, and the body's been in that state for at least a few months, maybe longer. The plastic bags and duct tape seem to have preserved parts of the remains, but there's enough decomposition that it's going to be tough." Mathis pinched the bridge of his nose in frustration. No ID, no prints on file, no witnesses. Jesus, it's like someone dumped this out here knowing we'd have nothing to go on. The medical examiner, Dr. Karen Holt, emerged from the edge of the crime scene, peeling off her latex gloves as she approached the two officers. Her usually stern face bore an even heavier grimness from what she'd seen. "Sheriff, you're looking at a male in his late 20s or early 30s based on bone structure and dental analysis. Cause of death? Too early to say, but it wasn't pleasant. Multiple clean dismemberment cuts. Someone either had surgical knowledge or access to professional-grade equipment when they did this." Mathis exchanged uneasy glances with Rogers. "So, not some spur-of-the-moment killing. This bastard planned it." "Planned it, and wanted to make damn sure he wouldn't be traced," Holt replied. "Whoever did this was methodical. No hair, no fibers, nothing obvious left behind." The remains were transported to Jefferson City for further forensic testing, but Mathis knew they couldn't afford to sit around waiting for answers. Within hours, his team began combing through missing persons reports from counties across Missouri and surrounding states. The body didn't belong to any local missing person cases filed in the last year. The team expanded the search to federal databases, hoping fingerprints or dental records might bring up a match. Nothing. It was as if this man didn't exist, casting a wider net. "Sheriff, all I'm saying is if this guy wasn't local, we're already looking at a hell of a challenge," Rogers said 2 days later as the two shared a tense discussion at the Boone County Sheriff's Office. She gestured at the growing stack of files on the conference table in front of them, labeled with names of missing persons from out of state. Mathis nodded grimly. "Yeah, I know, Claire, but people don't just get murdered and chopped up for no reason. Somebody's gotta miss this guy. Family, friends, someone out there knows who he is or what happened to him." Their first lead came not from the body, but from forensic analysis of the suitcase itself. Technicians discovered traces of a unique type of mud caked into the seams. Mud only found in northern Tennessee near the Cumberland River Basin. It was a small clue, but one that suggested whoever dumped the suitcase might have come through Missouri from Tennessee. "All right, that's something," Mathis said as he leaned over the report, his coffee steaming beside him. "Get the word out to neighboring counties. Tennessee state troopers need to know we might be dealing with someone from their neck of the woods." A name at last week's turned into months, leaving the team frustrated and exhausted. The case was growing colder by the day. Then, in early 2007, a breakthrough finally arrived. Dr. Holt called Mathis directly, her voice shaking with a mix of excitement and urgency. "Doug, we've got it! DNA! We ran the victim's profile through CODIS again after they updated their databases, and this time, we got a hit." Mathis felt his heart lurch. "You're kidding me, who is he?" "His name is Daniel Harper, 27 years old. He's originally from Columbia, Missouri. His family reported him missing nearly a year ago, shortly after he'd graduated from the University of Missouri with a degree in computer science." Mathis leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. A name. A story. Finally, they weren't chasing a ghost anymore. Details about Daniel Harper's life began to emerge. He was brilliant, ambitious, and by most accounts, someone with a bright future ahead. His parents, Alice and Robert Harper, shared that Daniel had landed a lucrative tech job in Kansas City and had been thrilled about starting his career. However, he abruptly left his position in early 2006, claiming he'd found an even better opportunity. That was the last anyone had heard from him. "The job," Mathis murmured, brows furrowing as he read the notes from his team. What kind of job makes a guy leave everything behind and never come back? A sinister connection emerges. Alice Harper, Daniel's mother, broke down in tears when she learned her son's fate. He always called, always checked in, no matter how busy he was," she sobbed. "When he stopped answering, I knew something was wrong. I just wish we'd—" Her voice cracked. "I just wish we'd done more." Listening to Alice's anguish, Mathis felt a renewed determination. He promised her and her husband that they wouldn't stop until Daniel's killer was behind bars. Further investigation revealed that in the months before his disappearance, Daniel had been communicating with an old college acquaintance named Sarah Jennings. Sarah, it seemed, had convinced Daniel to leave his Kansas City job to join her in a mysterious business venture in Tennessee. When Sarah was tracked down and questioned, she revealed the truth with a look of shame. "It wasn't a business," she admitted. It was this group. They told us we could get rich quick. You know, one of those pyramid schemes, but it wasn't what I thought." Her words trailed off ominously. "What happened to Daniel, Sarah?" Mathis pressed, a gruff edge in his voice. Sarah shook her head, tears pooling in the corners of her eyes. "He didn't like it there. Said he felt trapped. He wanted to leave, but you didn't just leave." She gulped, her voice barely a whisper now. "They wouldn't let him." The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Daniel hadn't just vanished, he'd become a victim of something much darker, much deadlier than anyone could have imagined. Progress with DNA evidence. By the time the second anniversary of the Suitcase discovery rolled around in 2008, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. Deputy Claire Rogers described it as hitting an invisible brick wall. Leads had dried up, interviews yielded little insight, and even the most promising hunches led nowhere. With a body but no name, it felt like the case was unraveling into another dreaded cold file. A shadowy mystery destined to remain unsolved. But Sheriff Doug Mathis wasn't one to let go so easily. "The victim might be silent, but his DNA isn't," he said during an in-house briefing one afternoon. "That database keeps growing, and we keep trying. Science has a funny way of serving justice when we least expect it." A flicker of hope. In early 2008, advancements in DNA databases offered new possibilities. At the time, CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, was expanding its reach nationwide, connecting more law enforcement agencies and incorporating updated samples from unsolved crimes, missing persons, and convicted offenders. With the infrastructure now more robust than ever, Mathis saw an opening and ordered the limited evidence from the suitcase, a processed DNA profile of the victim, into CODIS for another comparison. Day after day, the team waited for results. Calls to the crime lab became routine. "Any matches yet?" Rogers asked so frequently that the forensic analyst on the other end would simply sigh before replying, "Not yet, deputy." Weeks turned into months and frustration began to fester. Without a match to any known missing persons, the team's morale dwindled. "Maybe he was someone who didn't have ties," one deputy suggested at a meeting. "No family, no friends, someone no one even knew was gone. No one lives in this world completely untied," Sheriff Mathis said firmly. His tone silenced the murmurs of hopelessness in the room. "Everybody belongs to somebody. We just haven't found them yet." The call that changed everything. Nearly 2 years later, in February of 2010, Sheriff Mathis's office phone rang early in the morning, too early by his typical standards. Groggily, he picked it up and muttered a gruff, "Mathis here. Sheriff, it's Karen Holt." The medical examiner's voice crackled through the receiver. Her tone was alert and excited, a sharp contrast to her usual methodical calmness. "We've got something! CODIS reported a hit on the DNA profile we submitted." Mathis sat up straighter in his chair. The words buzzed through his morning fog like ice water down his back. "You're serious?" He leaned forward, rubbing his temples to snap himself into focus. "CODIS? As in, we finally got the guy's name?" "Exactly," Holt replied. "His name is Daniel Harper, 27 years old, originally from Columbia, Missouri. He was reported missing by his family nearly 4 years ago." Mathis dropped the phone onto its cradle and sat in silence for a moment. 4 years, 4 devastating years of wondering, of dead leads, of silence. Finally the victim had a name, a story. The pieces start to fit within hours. Deputy Rogers was compiling everything she could find on Daniel Harper. What emerged was a heart-wrenching portrait of a young man full of potential, whose life had taken a cruel and unexpected turn. Daniel had been born and raised in Columbia, Missouri, into a tight-knit family. As the oldest of 3 siblings, he was adored by his younger brothers, and revered by his parents, Robert and Alice Harper. A brilliant student, Daniel had graduated from the University of Missouri in 2005, with a degree in computer science and plenty of job offers waiting in the wings. It seemed like the bright future anyone his age could dream of. But by early 2006, according to his parents' account, Daniel had suddenly quit his tech job in Kansas City. His mother told the detective conducting the follow-up interview, he said he'd found something better, something exciting, but he wouldn't elaborate. Daniel was never one to keep secrets, but whatever this was, he kept it close to his chest. And then came the break in communication. Robert Harper's voice trembled when he recounted to authorities how they'd tried to call their son countless times, only to be met with deafening silence. "We thought maybe he was just busy," he said, his voice breaking. "We told ourselves he'd call when he could." But the call never came. A mother's intuition, Alice Harper wasn't so easily convinced. Daniel always called, she emphasized. Even during busy weeks he'd make time. When a week turned into 2, then a month, I knew something wasn't right. In April of 2006, the family filed an official missing persons report, but law enforcement back then had little to go on. Daniel was an adult, which meant he was free to disappear if he wanted. No foul play was evident at the time, and the Harper family's hopes rested on the idea that he might resurface on his own. Yet deep down, Alice's motherly intuition whispered a darker truth. I just knew he wasn't out there living a happy life, I could feel it. Now, with the puzzle piece of Daniel's identity slotted into place, Mathis felt an odd blend of relief and dread. They had a name, but that name came with a history they could no longer ignore. Building a timeline. Piecing together Daniel's final months became an urgent priority. Investigators redirected resources to understand what had led a promising, grounded young man to his gruesome fate. A breakthrough came when they checked his phone records. Calls to an untraceable burner phone had been frequent in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, raising suspicions that Daniel might have been coaxed into some sort of secretive or illicit activity. Further interviews with old college friends unearthed another revelation. Daniel had been corresponding with an acquaintance named Sarah Jennings, a fellow Missouri grad who had since moved to Tennessee. She said she was working on a huge business opportunity, one of Daniel's friends recalled. You know, one of those too-good-to-be-true deals. This lead was enough for Mathis. Sarah Jennings was still alive and could hold the key to unraveling what truly happened to Daniel Harper. Renewed determination. For Mathis and his department, discovering Daniel Harper's name was more than just progress. It was a moral responsibility to bring closure to his family. "We owe it to this boy," Mathis murmured one night while poring over files. "The only thing crueler than death is leaving his family with half a story. We get them the rest of it, no matter the cost." With Daniel's name now at the forefront of their investigation, the real work of dissecting the chain of events leading to his gruesome death began. The investigation turns to personal connections. With Daniel Harper's identity confirmed, law enforcement began the grueling task of piecing together the final months of his life. The focus shifted from the fragmented remains to trying to understand who Daniel was, his hopes, his friends, his routines, and, most importantly, the people who were closest to him before he disappeared. The notion was simple. Somewhere in Daniel's relationships lay the key to unraveling what had gone so horrifically wrong. It wouldn't be easy. Layers of time, distance, and fading memories had buried potential leads, leaving investigators with fragments of conversations and decisions that seemed unremarkable years ago. With determination etched into every step, Sheriff Doug Mathis assigned his most steadfast deputies, Deputy Claire Rogers and Detective Tom Grayson, to follow the deepest threads of Daniel's life, a network of shadows. "Start with his phone records," Mathis said in a staff meeting 2 days after Daniel's identity was confirmed. "Figure out who he was in regular contact with and when it stopped. Someone knows something, they always do." Deputy Rogers sat at the desk in the dimly lit conference room, papers scattered across the table in front of her. "His last known location pins him in Kansas City," she began, fiddling with a pencil as she spoke. "But here's where it gets weird. His calls in the weeks leading to his disappearance don't track with his normal patterns. There were a dozen calls to one untraceable number, a burner phone most likely. Every single one happened after midnight and lasted anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour." Detective Grayson frowned and leaned forward. "A burner phone? Sounds like a classic red flag. Could be someone from out of state. Maybe the start of a bad business deal or—" He paused, shrugging. "Something illegal." "Exactly," Rogers replied. "We pulled logs from his last active cell tower hit. His phone went dark in northern Tennessee near Clarksville. That's over 400 miles from Kansas City. Whatever he was doing, he wasn't sticking close to home." Mathis interjected, his tone serious. "So we've got him leaving behind a well-paying tech job, making secretive calls and heading out of state. All for what? What did he tell his family or his friends about moving down south?" "I've been looking into that," said Rogers, thumbing through her notes. "His mom, Alice Harper, said he sounded optimistic in the weeks before he left Kansas City. She mentioned he told her he had found an amazing opportunity. But when she pressed him for details, he dodged the questions." "That's because he didn't want her to worry," said Mathis, shaking his head. "God knows whatever pulled him to Tennessee probably wasn't what he thought it was. Look into college friends, co-workers, anyone he could have confided in, and get that burner phone tracked, even if it's a long shot." Sarah Jennings, the Link 1 name, surfaced repeatedly during interviews. Sarah Jennings. A former college classmate of Daniel's at the University of Missouri, Sarah had apparently stayed in touch with him after graduation. Several of Daniel's friends remembered him casually mentioning her name in conversations. According to one friend, Sarah had reached out a few months before Daniel's disappearance with an exciting business opportunity. "Sounds like a setup," Grayson muttered as he scanned the interview transcripts. "How often do we see this? Old friend pops up out of the blue, offers the moon, and suddenly someone's life takes a turn for the worse." Rogers leaned over the table, pointing to Sarah's last known contact details. "She moved to Tennessee shortly after finishing college, around the same time Daniel started those burner phone calls. This business opportunity she sold him on? It's our next lead." Within 48 hours, law enforcement tracked Sarah Jennings to her home in Clarksville, Tennessee. The house was modest and unassuming, with a neatly kept front lawn and wind chimes tinkling softly in the breeze. Deputy Rogers and Detective Grayson knocked on the door, their presence casting long shadows in the late afternoon sunlight. The interrogation. Sarah opened the door cautiously, her expression darting between polite confusion and guarded nervousness. "Can I help you?" she asked, clutching a towel as if she had just stepped out of the shower. "Sarah Jennings?" Rogers asked, holding up her badge. "We're with Boone County Sheriff's Department out of Missouri. We need to ask you some questions about Daniel Harper." Sarah froze, her fingers tightening on the doorknob. "Daniel?" she echoed softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Why would you need to talk to me about him?" "We believe you may have been in contact with him shortly before he went missing," Grayson said pointedly. "Do you mind if we come in and talk?" After a pregnant pause, Sarah stepped aside and invited them into the living room. She perched on the edge of her couch like someone balancing on the tightrope of denial and fear. Rogers wasted no time. "We know you called Daniel multiple times before he went missing. His friends say you mentioned a business opportunity in Tennessee. Let's cut to the chase, Sarah. Why did Daniel leave Kansas City, and where did he end up?" For a moment, Sarah stared at the floor in silence. Then she looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered. "I just wanted to help him. I never thought he'd get hurt." "Hurt how?" Grayson pushed, his voice firm but measured. "What was he involved in?" Sarah wiped at her face, her hands trembling. It wasn't a real business," she admitted finally. "It was this group. More like a network, really. They promised we'd make good money fast with very little risk. I believed it at first. I thought they were legit." Rogers narrowed her eyes. "Who's they? And why couldn't Daniel walk away?" "They wouldn't let him," Sarah said, barely above a whisper. "He wasn't like the others. He didn't fall for all the promises. They kept trying to convince him, but he said something felt off. When he wanted to leave, they got angry, said he was a liability. Both officers exchanged grim looks. Grayson leaned forward, his tone darker now. "Sarah, we're going to need names. Everybody in that group. Who ran it, where they went." "I'll tell you everything," Sarah murmured. "Just, you have to promise me they won't find out I talked. They'd come for me too." A broader web. Sarah's confession confirmed what law enforcement had feared. Daniel had walked into the jaws of a dangerous, manipulative group. Whether it was a pyramid scheme, a cult, or something even darker remained to be seen. But what was clear was that his decision to follow what he thought was an opportunity had cost him everything. From here, Mathis knew the investigation had moved into dangerous territory. "This is no longer just about one victim," he told his team in a meeting later that week. "We're dealing with a group that's not afraid to silence people who question them. Our job is to pull them into the sunlight before anyone else gets hurt." Sarah's mysterious confession. As Detective Grayson and Deputy Rogers sat across from Sarah Jennings in the dimly lit interview room, the air was thick with a tension that only deep secrets and hard truths could bring. The walls, plain steel gray, seemed to close in on Sarah as she nervously fidgeted in her seat. Her hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles were white. She still hadn't spoken much since agreeing to come down to the station. Her silence only deepened the mystery. Rogers leaned forward first, her voice steady yet firm. "Sarah, you've already told us that you introduced Daniel to this group. You've admitted that you believed their promises, a big business opportunity, right? But we both know it wasn't what you thought it was." Sarah's eyes darted from one officer to the other, tears threatening to spill onto her cheeks. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. Finally, with a shaky breath, she whispered, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Rogers pushed gently, but deliberately. "Sarah, you were his friend. If you didn't mean for this to happen, then help us now. Tell us everything. What kind of group are we dealing with here?" "It wasn't a business." Sarah rubbed her temples as if trying to organize her thoughts, or maybe just fighting the regret that seemed to consume her. "It wasn't a business," she said finally, her voice trembling. "At least, not in the way they made it sound at first. They called themselves Ascension Alliance. They came off as this exclusive, invite-only network for young professionals. You know, people like me and Daniel. They promised wealth, power, freedom. It sounded like everything you want to hear when you're desperate for a way out." "A way out of what?" Grayson asked, raising an eyebrow. Sarah gave a bitter laugh, her voice laced with self-loathing. "Everything! Student debt, dead-end jobs, living paycheck to paycheck. We were young. It's easy to fall for something that sounds too good to be true when you're barely holding it together." She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "They made it seem so professional. Conferences in fancy hotels, sleek marketing. They said they were recruiting the brightest minds in the country to play on a higher level. They made you feel special, like you were chosen." The recruitment Rogers scribbled notes on her pad. "So, who recruited you? Who's the face behind the alliance?" Sarah sighed deeply but avoided direct eye contact. "His name's Jacob Moore. He's charismatic, the kind of person you can't say no to. I met him at one of their so-called networking events. He talked about financial independence, building generational wealth, freedom from the grind." Her voice broke a little. "I believed him. I really thought they were legitimate at first." "When did you bring Daniel into this?" Rogers pressed. Sarah shook her head, a tear finally sliding down her cheek. "It wasn't like I went looking to hurt him. Daniel and I had stayed in touch after college, and I saw how miserable he was in that soul-sucking tech job in Kansas City. He told me he hated it, that he wanted something exciting in his life. I thought I was doing him a favor by introducing him to Ascension Alliance." "So, you invited him into the group," Grayson said, summarizing. "And what then?" "They loved him," Sarah said, almost bitterly. "Daniel was everyone's favorite, smart, driven, a thinker. He soaked everything up like a sponge. At first I thought he was really buying into it. But then," she paused, her voice lowering, "he started asking the wrong questions." "What went wrong?" Grayson cocked his head, sensing something crucial. "What do you mean by the wrong questions?" Sarah hesitated, biting her lip. "The Alliance? They weren't actually about building wealth. That was just the bait. Once you joined, they started testing you, pushing boundaries, controlling you. At first it was little things, mandatory conferences that lasted all night, exercises in loyalty, cutting off people who didn't align with your vision. Then it got darker." "Darker how?" Rogers asked sharply. No one questioned Jacob, Sarah whispered. But Daniel did. He started pulling me aside, saying things didn't add up. He told me he felt like they were hiding something big. I told him to just let it go. I thought if he stopped pushing, they'd leave him alone. But he didn't let it go, Grayson added grimly, filling in the blanks. Sarah nodded, wiping tears from her face. He told Jacob he wanted out, said this wasn't what he signed up for, that he didn't like where it was heading. Jacob didn't take it well. What does it didn't take it well mean? Rogers pressed. Be specific, Sarah. Sarah seemed to shrink into herself. Her body trembled as she spoke. After that, everything changed. They made sure Daniel was isolated. They stopped inviting him to the public seminars and started putting him in these closed-door meetings. I don't know what they told him in there, but when I tried to talk to him after that, he seemed distant, angry even. He told me to stay out of it. Rogers leaned forward, dropping her pen on the notepad. What happened the last time you saw Daniel? When was it? Sarah looked up for the first time, her eyes clouded with guilt. It was about a week before he disappeared. He called me late at night. He was scared, genuinely scared. He told me he was going to leave for real this time, and he wanted to know if I'd help him. Sarah took a shuddering breath. I didn't. I was too afraid. I told him I couldn't get involved. And that was it? Rogers asked. You never spoke to him again? Never. Her voice cracked. The next week I went to one of the Alliance meetings and Jacob made some cryptic remarks about how loose threads had to be dealt with. I knew he was talking about Daniel. A key confession. Sarah's face was blotched red with tears, but she wasn't done. I didn't know what to do. If I went to the police, they'd come for me too. You don't leave the Alliance, it's like a cult. Once you're in, they own you. Grayson exchanged a look with Rogers, his voice hard. So you're telling us Jacob Moore had Daniel killed? She nodded slowly, defeated. Yes. Jacob and his inner circle. They handle anyone they see as a threat to the Alliance. I wasn't there, but I know in my gut that's what happened. They made Daniel disappear. The bigger picture. Sarah's confession was a bombshell, painting Ascension Alliance as more than just a shady pyramid scheme. It was a tightly controlled, dangerous organization with blood on its hands. Sheriff Mathis stood near the observation mirror, listening to every word. When the interview ended, he turned to his team, his voice grim. We have what we need, Mathis said. This isn't just about Daniel Harper anymore. We've got an organization that's willing to kill to protect its secrets. This investigation goes deeper than any of us could have imagined. Following the trail of the multi-level organization. The confession from Sarah Jennings was a breakthrough for Sheriff Doug Mathis and his team. For the first time, they had a name. Ascension Alliance. No longer just a nebulous notion of a business opportunity, the group was shaping up to be something far darker. A manipulative scheme hidden under the guise of legitimacy, luring in hopeful recruits only to trap them in a web of control and violence. With Sarah's information, the investigation shifted into high gear. But following the breadcrumbs left by a secretive organization with far-reaching tentacles wasn't going to be easy. Sitting in his office, Mathis laid a hand on the growing pile of evidence. Sarah's statements, burner phone records, meeting locations, anything the department had been able to extract over months of dogged work. We've got pieces of the puzzle, he said to Deputy Rogers and Detective Grayson. But the damn thing still doesn't fit together. Looking for patterns. What about their footprint on the internet? Rogers asked, tapping a pen against her notebook. Groups like this always have some kind of online presence. Maybe not obvious, but there's gotta be forums, websites, invitations floating around. They have to recruit somehow. We're already on it, Grayson interjected, crossing his arms. I started working with the cybercrimes unit out of St. Louis. They're sifting through social media, digging for mentions of Ascension Alliance. It's slow going, though. These people are smart, they're not broadcasting what they're doing. The few references we've found are cryptic, Rogers frowned. Cryptic how? Grayson pulled out his laptop, opening a tab displaying a grainy forum thread. The thread's title was innocuous enough. Achieve your full potential, an exclusive opportunity for high performers, but the replies beneath it hinted at something otherworldly. It's all this new age jargon, Grayson muttered, scrolling through the thread. Unlock your higher self, ascend above the system, break free and thrive. It's like they're selling enlightenment and riches in one go, hooking people who feel trapped in their lives. Sounds like a cult, Rogers said bluntly. Mathis straightened in his chair, his brow furrowed. If it walks like a cult and talks like a cult... He didn't need to finish the sentence. From promises to control. The team's next step was to map how Ascension Alliance operated. Sarah's confession gave them crucial insight into the organization's methods designed to ensnare. At first, recruits were drawn in by promises of hefty paychecks and an escape from their 9-to-5 grind. Exclusive events held in upscale hotels were carefully crafted to lure them further. Uniformed greeters, slick presentations, catered meals. "They make you feel like a CEO," Sarah had said in her confession. But behind the curtain, Ascension Alliance wasn't about success, it was about control. Recruits were pressured to attend mandatory weekend retreats where team-building exercises blurred the lines between professional and personal. Over time, the group isolated members, demanding absolute loyalty and cutting ties to outsiders. "Their goal," Rogers noted grimly, "is complete dependency. Take people who are already vulnerable, fill their heads with dreams, and then make them believe the organization is the only way forward. It's disgusting." Mathis rubbed his temple. "And when someone like Daniel sees through the smoke, they don't just let him walk away." The hunt for Jacob Moore. With renewed focus, the team fixed its sights on Jacob Moore, the charismatic and manipulative leader Sarah had described. "We need to find this guy," Mathis said, slamming his palm on the desk at yet another morning briefing. "If he's the one pulling strings, he's our key to unraveling this thing. Do we have anything on him?" Grayson nodded sharply. "We dug into Sarah's contacts and she gave us a starting point, a ranch outside Nashville, Tennessee. A former recruit claims it was used for Alliance retreats, says Moore had been spotted there as recently as 6 months ago." Mathis let out a low whistle. "A ranch? So they're hiding in plain sight. Any chance we get an address?" Grayson smiled faintly. "Already done. The property's under the name of one of Moore's inner circle, a guy named Andrew Tate, but I'll warn you, Sheriff, it's 500 acres of private land. They'd see us coming a mile away." "Then we don't let them see us," Mathis said coolly. Surveillance and strategy. Over the next few weeks, the Boone County Sheriff's Department coordinated with the FBI to conduct covert surveillance around the property. The ranch was heavily fortified, high fences, cameras mounted at key entry points, and guards who patrolled the perimeter with flashlights late into the night. "This isn't just a retreat," Rogers muttered as she watched the footage from a drone flyover. "This is a compound." Grayson leaned closer to the screen. "Look there." He pointed to a group of figures emerging from a barn. One man stood out, tall, with a commanding presence. He moved with the air of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Is that Moore?" Mathis asked. "Matches Sarah's description," Grayson said. "That's him, all right. Looks like we've got our guy." The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit joined the case, lending their expertise to profile Moore. "He's a textbook narcissist," one agent explained during a debrief. "He thrives on control and manipulation. His charm is his weapon. He builds loyalty by making people think he's their savior." Uncovering the network. As the surveillance continued, it became clear that Ascension Alliance was more than just a small operation. The team uncovered financial transactions linking the organization to accounts in multiple states, with branches in Colorado, Texas, and Florida. Records showed money funneling through shell companies and cryptic wire transfers. "This thing is huge," Rogers said, scrolling through spreadsheets of data. "They're not just conning people, they're running scams on a national scale. And they're using cult tactics to do it," Grayson added. "Promising success, then turning their members into pawns. It's a cult with a business front." Mathis leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "If this is what they're doing on the surface, God knows what's happening behind closed doors. How many Daniels are out there caught in this?" The pressure builds. The deeper the investigation went, the more tension mounted in the small Boone County Sheriff's Office. Standing in their way was time. Moore and his inner circle weren't stupid. They would sense the walls closing in eventually, and rogue organizations like Ascension Alliance rarely folded quietly. But Sheriff Mathis wasn't about to let them slip away. "Make no mistake," he told his team on a late-night strategy meeting, pointing to Moore's photo pinned to the corkboard. "This man thinks he's untouchable. He's not. We'll bring him in, and when we do, we'll tear down everything he's built." The key members are exposed. Months of painstaking investigation, tireless surveillance, and hours upon hours of combing through financial records and witness statements had finally begun to pay off. Sheriff Doug Mathis leaned back in his chair, staring at the corkboard that now dominated the far wall of his office, the faces of Ascension Alliance's most influential members staring back at him. Each photo pinned neatly in place with an ominous red circle drawn around it. The once murky web of secrecy surrounding the organization was starting to unravel, revealing the hierarchy of individuals who had been maintaining Jacob Moore's empire of manipulation and fear. These weren't nameless, faceless individuals anymore. The investigation had given them identities, and with those identities came power over the case. Building the pyramid. Jacob Moore, on top. At the very top of the structure sat Jacob Moore, the mastermind and founder of the Ascension Alliance. The investigation revealed Moore to be even more cunning and dangerous than Sarah Jennings had described. The FBI behavioral profiling experts had been right. Jacob wasn't just charismatic, he was controlling, intelligent, and methodical. Every piece of evidence pointed to him being fluent in psychological manipulation, preying on the vulnerabilities of his victims to build unshakable loyalty. The teams reviewing his background uncovered shocking information. Before founding Ascension Alliance, Jacob had been embroiled in smaller get-rich-quick scams and Ponzi schemes, facing accusations of fraud from as early as 1999. Though none of the charges ever stuck, it was evident Moore had learned a critical lesson: perfect the art of staying untouchable. Every move he made was calculated to shield himself, always forcing others to carry out the organization's dirty work while he maintained the illusion of legitimacy. Grayson summed it up succinctly during a late-night briefing. "The guy is a ghost. You don't deal with someone like Jacob Moore directly. You deal with the people he's brainwashed into running his machine." The right hand, Andrew Tate. One such person was Andrew Tate, Moore's second-in-command. If Moore was the brain of the operation, Andrew Tate was the enforcer. Surveillance on the Tennessee ranch had repeatedly placed Tate at the center of operations, barking orders, managing recruits, and overseeing the many so-called loyalty exercises that Sarah Jennings had hinted at in her confession. Tate, a former Marine with a dishonorable discharge for reasons the investigation couldn't immediately disclose, was the perfect poster boy for control. He operated without question, carrying out Moore's directions to the letter and maintaining strict hierarchy among the members. "I've got Tate pegged as the type of guy who'd follow Moore off a cliff if it came to it," Rogers had said grimly. "He's the muscle, sure, but more than that he's loyal, and the recruits look up to him." Recruits idolized Tate as a figure of discipline and control, but his background wasn't as squeaky clean as the Alliance made him appear. Financial records showed he'd been the facilitator for dozens of illegal transactions, moving money into accounts under fake businesses to avoid detection. Witness interviews painted him as ruthless, someone who didn't hesitate to enforce the organization's rules by any means necessary. Sarah Jennings had even hinted in her confession that Tate was responsible for handling problems when someone crossed the Alliance. Investigators were certain that handling problems could mean silencing people like Daniel Harper, the architect of finances, Mia Caldwell. While Jacob Moore controlled the stage and Andrew Tate enforced with an iron fist, Mia Caldwell was the mind behind Ascension Alliance's financial empire. A CPA by trade with experience at a top-tier accounting firm, Mia was the one who ensured that Moore's empire ran smoothly and undetected. Rogers was the one who connected the dots that tied Mia into the organization. "She's the one who keeps the money clean," Rogers explained to Mathis one afternoon. "All those shell companies we've been tracking across state lines, guess who's listed as a consultant on every single one?" By all appearances, Mia was just another high-paid professional with a spotless record to boot, but further digging into her personal life revealed her close ties to Jacob. The two had met at one of Moore's earlier fraudulent schemes years before Ascension Alliance was even a concept. In the years since, Mia had become not only a key player in managing the organization's money, but also one of its staunchest defenders. Mia operated the financial branches of the organization like clockwork, using offshore accounts, cryptocurrencies, and twisted corporate structures to make the Alliance's revenues virtually untraceable. "Nothing sticks to her," Mathis said, frustrated after yet another fruitless discussion with financial analysts. "She's like a damn ghost in the numbers." The inner circle, faces in the shadows beyond Moore, Tate, and Caldwell, there was an entire inner circle, a group of lieutenants scattered across the country. Each of these individuals managed regional operations, working to recruit new members, silence dissenters, and expand the organization's influence. Pinning them down wouldn't be easy. They operated mostly through proxy, rarely showing their faces at public meetings or recruitment events. Among them were names like, who ran Ascension Alliance's Southwest operations, managing a base out of Texas. Victor was a former motivational speaker known for his eloquent pitches and ability to draw new recruits. The Northeast region's strategist, who coordinated public engagements and controlled much of the online recruitment. Though rarely seen in person, her tech-savvy fingerprints were all over the group's web-based operations. Each lieutenant in the inner circle had their own specialty: legal defense, propaganda, recruitment, or loyalty enforcement. Together, they had propped up Moore's empire for years, ensuring he stayed untouchable at the top. Breaking the silence. The more the investigation uncovered about Moore's closest allies, the clearer it became that Ascension Alliance was anything but a small-time scam. Mathis understood that taking down one or even two key players wouldn't be enough. "They'll weasel their way out of it," he said one night, studying the faces on the corkboard. "Tate will claim he was following orders. Mia will hide behind the paperwork. And Moore? Hell, he's probably already laying the groundwork for his next scam while we're chasing his breadcrumbs." But cracks had already begun to form within the Alliance's ranks. Pressure from law enforcement and scrutiny over financial irregularities meant key players were starting to worry. Several minor players, regional recruiters primarily, had quietly reached out to investigators with small pieces of information, hoping to save themselves. With time, Mathis knew, someone in the inner circle might break. The next target. The key to tearing down Ascension Alliance was now a game of chess. "We may not be able to start at the top," Mathis said in a midnight strategy meeting, his team huddled in the small conference room at the sheriff's office. He gestured toward Mia Caldwell's photo. "But if we can take out the person managing the purse strings, we can stop the whole machine from running. No money means no loyalty, and no hiding." Grayson nodded in agreement. "And Tate, he's dangerous. If anyone pushes back, it's going to be him. We'll need a team ready to act once we've got enough evidence." "And Moore?" Rogers asked, pointing to the smirking face in the center of the board. Mathis stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. "We'll get him, but we burn his empire down first." Breaking the silence. By 2012, the investigation into the Ascension Alliance had stretched far beyond the Boone County Sheriff's Office. With the FBI now fully involved, surveillance efforts had multiplied. Evidence was being pieced together across state lines, and the walls around Jacob Moore's empire of deceit were slowly closing in. Yet, for all their progress, there was one thing Sheriff Mathis and his team lacked: a direct witness who could blow the whole thing open. The inner circle remained steadfastly loyal to their leader. Every move they made seemed calculated, every word carefully chosen. Even the minor players they'd interrogated were hesitant to reveal anything more than bare scraps of information, nervous, fearful, as if confessing too much would bring the wrath of the Alliance down upon them. "You can feel it," Deputy Claire Rogers said during a late-night briefing. She tapped the corkboard filled with photos and scribbled maps. "These people aren't just brainwashed, they're terrified. They think Moore is untouchable, and they're too scared to risk testing that belief." "Terrified," Mathis repeated, folding his arms, his jaw clenching. "But everyone breaks eventually. We just need the right crack." A desperate phone call. That crack came on a cold February night in 2012. It wasn't something the team had anticipated. It came out of nowhere. Mathis had just settled down at home with a glass of scotch and a pile of case notes when his personal phone buzzed on the coffee table. The number was unlisted. "This is Mathis," he answered gruffly, assuming it was another routine follow-up or media inquiry. I need to talk to someone," the voice on the other end stammered. It was a woman, hushed and panicked. "But it has to be private. It has to stay between us or I'm dead. Do you understand me? Dead." Mathis sat up straight, his instincts kicking in immediately. "Who is this? Ma'am, you need to calm down and tell me what's going on." The voice hesitated, trembling. I used to work for Ascension Alliance. I know things that can help you. But if they find out I've talked to you, I'm done for. They'll find me, just like they found Daniel." The mention of Daniel Harper sent a chill through Mathis's spine. He gripped the phone tighter. "I hear you," he said steadily. "We can keep you safe, but you need to tell me everything you know." "I can't do it over the phone," she whispered. "Meet me, somewhere public, somewhere safe." Mathis didn't hesitate. "Tell me where." The bargain. The next evening, Mathis and Rogers sat in an unassuming diner on the outskirts of Boone County, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in the background. Their contact, a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a worn demeanor, shuffled nervously into the booth across from them. She introduced herself as Leah Sanders, a former accountant for Ascension Alliance who had worked directly under Mia Caldwell, the organization's financial architect. Leah's hands shook as she wrapped them around a cup of coffee. She glanced over her shoulder every few seconds, her paranoia spilling into every gesture. "You don't understand what these people are capable of," she started, her voice low. "They don't just take your loyalty, they own you. They know everything about you, your family, your weaknesses." She shook her head. "It doesn't end when you leave. They make sure you never feel safe again." "Leah," Rogers said gently, leaning forward, "you've already taken the hardest step by coming to us. Nobody owns you anymore. Now you need to help us take them down." Mathis nodded. "And if Moore and his people are as dangerous as you say, the only way we can stop them is if you tell us what you know. If you help us, we'll protect you, but you've got to trust us." Leah's eyes darted between them. At last she sighed, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of years had just come crashing down on her. "All right," she murmured, "I'll tell you everything." Inside the Alliance, Leah's testimony was the break the investigation had desperately needed. For hours she recounted the inner workings of Ascension Alliance, the meticulous recruitment tactics, the manipulative relationships, and the lengths to which Jacob Moore and his inner circle would go to maintain control. "It wasn't just about the money," Leah explained. "To Jacob, the money was secondary. What he really wanted was power. Absolute power. He wanted people so loyal to him that they'd turn their backs on their own families if he asked them to. And he got it too. He had this way of making you feel like he was the only person in the world who truly saw your potential, who truly believed in you. But one wrong step, and it all flipped." "What do you mean by flipped?" Rogers asked cautiously. "Punishments," Leah said, her lips tightening into a thin line. "They didn't come out and say punishment. They called it corrective action. But believe me, it wasn't subtle. Public humiliations, financial penalties, sometimes physical intimidation, you name it. And if you tried to leave—" She trailed off, the color draining from her face. "Well, you already know what happened to Daniel Harper." Mathis leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "So you're saying Moore personally ordered Daniel's death?" Leah bit her lip before nodding. "He didn't do it himself, that's not his style, but yes, he called Daniel a loose thread. That's what he always said when someone was becoming a problem, when someone put the organization at risk." "And Andrew Tate?" Mathis continued. "Was he the one who carried it out?" Leah hesitated, but eventually nodded again. Tate was the one who handled the loose threads. He didn't ask questions, he just did whatever Jacob told him to do." Every word was another nail in Ascension Alliance's coffin, but Leah wasn't done. Evidence in the shadows. Leah didn't just bring testimonies, she brought evidence. "I kept records," she admitted, sliding a small flash drive across the table. "Not much, I had to be careful or they'd have figured it out. But there's enough on here to prove how they moved the money. Shell companies, offshore accounts, falsified invoices. Mia Caldwell ran it all. And Jacob, he pulled every string." Mathis held the drive carefully, his expression unreadable. "If this checks out, Leah, you might have just handed us the key to bring them down." "That's what I want," she said, her voice fierce despite the tremble in her hands. "I want them gone, but I want protection too. You said you'd keep me safe. I'll do whatever it takes, but you have to promise me they won't find me." The balance shifts. Over the next few weeks, Leah's flash drive became the centerpiece of the investigation. The financial data she provided confirmed long-standing suspicions about Ascension Alliance's operations, how they laundered money, exploited recruits, and maintained their shadowy organization across state lines. Combined with Leah's testimony and Sarah Jennings' earlier confession, the case against Jacob Moore and his inner circle began to solidify. The pressure was mounting. For the first time, Mathis sensed that the power dynamics were shifting. Jacob Moore, once untouchable, now had cracks in his fortress, and Mathis was determined to smash his way through them. "This is it," Mathis said during a late-night meeting with his team. He pointed to the growing wall of files and photos in the room. "This is how we burn it down. First Mia and Tate, then Moore. We start pulling threads until this whole damn thing unravels." Rogers nodded, her eyes sharp with determination. "They silenced Daniel, but they're not silencing us." Grayson leaned back in his chair, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We're coming for them, and this time they won't see it coming." The thrilling pursuit. It was late March 2014 when everything finally came to a breaking point. 2 years of relentless investigation, countless hours of surveillance, interviews with terrified former members, and meticulous groundwork had laid the foundation for the inevitable, the takedown of Ascension Alliance and its ruthless leader, Jacob Moore. For Sheriff Doug Mathis and his team, this wasn't just another case. This was personal, A battle for justice for Daniel Harper and countless others who had been lured, manipulated, and discarded by the Alliance. Mathis stood at the front of the Boone County Sheriff's tactical room, his voice calm but laced with a gravitas that settled heavily over the room. Around him sat a mix of local officers, FBI agents, and a SWAT team specially assigned to the operation. "This is what we've been working toward," Mathis began, tapping a pointer against a large map of Salida, Colorado, where Jacob Moore and his inner circle had established their last known stronghold. A sprawling property on the outskirts of the town, hidden behind dense pine forests and fortified like a military compound, had become their suspected headquarters. "This isn't just some corporate office," Mathis continued. "It's a damn fortress. They've got guards, cameras, and we're expecting them to put up resistance. Jacob Moore isn't going down without a fight." Deputy Claire Rogers, sitting toward the front, raised her hand. "And what about Andrew Tate? His file says he's prior military. Any indication he's still running security for them?" Grayson, flipping through a dossier, nodded grimly. "Oh, he's there. Surveillance has him pacing the perimeter like it's a war zone. If anyone's gonna make this ugly, it's Tate." Mathis set the pointer down and leaned against the table. "Tate is dangerous, but he's not invincible. We go in carefully, methodically. The goal is to apprehend as many of them alive as possible, but I won't lie to you, this could get messy." The plan. Over the next few hours, the tactical team laid out a meticulous strategy. Mathis and the SWAT commander reviewed the satellite images and aerial drone footage of the compound. The property was massive, 2 acres of heavily forested land with a central mansion and several outbuildings. Cameras were mounted on tall wooden posts near all major access points, and guards patrolled in pairs. "This place wasn't built for living," Rogers muttered, staring at the blueprints. "It was built to keep people out, or keep them in." The FBI team lead outlined the approach. "We'll come in from 3 sides, east, west, and south. The north boundary is too steep, it's natural terrain they probably think is impenetrable. We'll be using that to our advantage to surprise them. Drones will provide visual cover before we breach the main property." Mathis rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "And Jacob Moore? What if he tries to run?" "We've got roadblocks set up on every viable escape route," another agent chimed in. "Air surveillance will track anything that goes wheels up. Trust me, Sheriff, he's not getting out of this one." Grayson smirked from his corner of the room. Famous last words. The moment arrives. The morning of the operation was unseasonably cold for Colorado in March. A thin mist hung over the Salida forest, curling ghost-like around the pine trees as the tactical units moved into position. Every breath visible in the frigid air was a reminder of the tension, the calm before the storm. In the command van parked nearly half a mile away, Mathis watched the live drone feeds on a laptop screen. The compound looked deceptively quiet. Guards patrolled with their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, unaware that dozens of officers surrounded them in the trees. "This guy doesn't have a clue what's coming," Rogers muttered, standing beside Mathis. "Let's hope it stays that way," Mathis replied. Then, into his radio, he began issuing commands. "Team Alpha, hold position. Team Bravo, move in on my mark." Grayson, geared up and sitting in a tactical vehicle nearby, adjusted his earpiece. "Hey, Sheriff," he crackled over the comms, "you ready to bring this guy down? I've been waiting for this for 2 years." Mathis smirked. "Don't get cocky, Grayson, let's keep focused." Then came the call from Drone Recon. Movement spotted near the barn, multiple individuals including one fitting Jacob Moore's description. Mathis didn't hesitate. "Copy that. Teams Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, go. Breach in 3, 2, 1, go." The breach. The first explosion was deafening, a flashbang detonating at the southern gate and sending the guards scrambling. Before they could react, Team Alpha breached the eastern side of the property, their rifles trained on the panicked defenders. Yells echoed through the compound as bullets ricocheted off the metal siding of one of the outbuildings. Smoke began to billow in the air, adding to the confusion. "Get down! Hands where we can see them!" an officer barked, pinning one of the guards to the ground. Meanwhile, Rogers and Grayson led Team Bravo toward the mansion itself. "Eyes open," Rogers warned. "Tate's gotta be close." As if on cue, a figure emerged from the shadows near the porch, a burly man carrying a shotgun. It was Andrew Tate. He aimed quickly, but Grayson was faster. "Drop it!" he shouted, but Tate only sneered, firing once before darting back inside the house. "He missed!" shouted Rogers, adrenaline pumping. "Move! Move!" The team stormed the front door, helmets low, shields raised as gunfire erupted from within. The capture. While chaos erupted outside, the darker business of chasing Jacob Moore unfolded inside. Mathis, staying behind to monitor the operation, watched as one of the drone feeds revealed a figure slipping out the back of the mansion toward a hidden vehicle. It was Moore. "He's running," Mathis muttered into the comms. "North Perimeter Team, do you have eyes on Moore?" A static-filled reply came back. "We see him, Sheriff. He's heading for an unregistered off-road vehicle." Mathis grabbed his gear and bolted for one of the trucks. "Stall him. I'm on my way." The chase that ensued was as tense as it was fast. Moore's off-road vehicle hurtled through the narrow forest trails, kicking up dirt and debris, while Mathis and the pursuing officers pushed their trucks to the limit. Helicopters buzzed overhead, tracking Moore's every turn. "Cut him off before the ridge!" Mathis shouted into his radio. "He'll have to ditch the car if he tries to go over." As they predicted, Moore lost control, skidding to a halt just before the edge of a steep ravine. He stumbled out of the vehicle, breathing heavily as he looked for a way out, a way that didn't exist. "End of the road, Jacob!" Mathis bellowed, leveling his weapon. "Hands in the air!" Moore turned slowly, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Mathis stepped forward, his voice calm but cold. "I understand perfectly. You preyed on innocent people. You took their lives, their money, and their freedom. It ends here." Moore hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then with a resigned sigh he raised his hands. Victory at last. By the end of the day, Jacob Moore, Andrew Tate, and several key members of the Inner Circle were in federal custody. The mansion and surrounding property were thoroughly searched, yielding countless documents, financial records, and digital evidence that would solidify their case. As the sun set over the Salida forest, Mathis stood outside the now-empty compound, taking it all in. Rogers approached, looking equally exhausted and relieved. "You did it," she said simply. Mathis shook his head. "We did it! This isn't just my win, it's justice for every one of their victims." After a long pause, he added, "But there's still work to do. This is just the beginning." Grayson, walking over with a satisfied grin, added, "Well, Sheriff, if this is the beginning, I can't wait to see the ending." Crime revealed. The courtroom was packed. Bright sunlight filtered in through the tall windows, casting long streaks of light on the polished wooden benches. On one side sat Sheriff Doug Mathis, Deputy Claire Rogers, and Detective Tom Grayson, along with key members of the FBI's task force. Across the aisle sat the defense team for Jacob Moore, Andrew Tate, and Mia Caldwell. Their once powerful aura of invincibility now reduced to a stony silence. At the center of it all, Moore leaned back in his chair, face impassive and smug, as if the trial was nothing more than a waste of his time. The air was heavy with tension. What was about to be revealed wasn't just about one crime. It was the boiling point of years of lies, manipulation, and human devastation orchestrated by the Ascension Alliance, and every journalist, survivor, and onlooker in the room knew it. The first major revelation, it was Leah Sanders, the former accountant-turned-whistleblower who was the first to take the stand. As she adjusted the microphone, her hands trembled slightly, but when her eyes met the gaze of Jacob Moore, any hesitancy in her demeanor gave way to steel determination. "You've sworn to tell the truth, Miss Sanders," said the prosecutor, a razor-sharp woman in a navy blue suit. "Let's start with the basics. Tell the court how you became involved with the Ascension Alliance." Leah glanced briefly at Mathis, who gave her the slightest nod of reassurance. Taking a deep breath, she began. "I joined in 2007 after being recruited at one of their seminars. At first it seemed like a godsend, an opportunity to escape debt, live a better life. Jacob Moore made it seem glamorous, elite." "And when did you realize it wasn't what it seemed?" the prosecutor pressed. "It didn't take long," Leah replied. "The money we were funneling didn't come from actual business ventures. It came from recruits. These were desperate people being promised a future that didn't exist, and if someone doubted the system or refused to participate, they were ostracized. Or worse." The prosecutor leaned in slightly. "Worse, you say? Are you referring to examples like Daniel Harper?" At the mention of Daniel's name, an audible murmur rippled through the courtroom. Leah swallowed hard. Yes, Daniel Harper was labeled a loose thread. Jacob Moore personally called him a threat to the organization. "And what did that mean, Miss Sanders? What happened to him?" Leah's voice tightened with remembered fear. "It meant termination. Andrew Tate, Jacob's enforcer, was tasked with ensuring people like Daniel never became a liability." Connecting the dots. As Leah stepped down, it was Sarah Jennings's turn to testify. The former recruit who had unwittingly brought Daniel into the alliance looked far older than her years, the toll of guilt etched into her face. "Sarah," the prosecutor began, walking slowly toward her, "you've admitted that you introduced Daniel Harper to the Ascension Alliance. Could you explain to the jury what you saw during your time with the group?" Sarah nodded hesitantly, gripping the sides of the witness stand like a lifeline. "At first everything seemed normal, even exciting. The events, the people, the promises. But then, once you were part of it, things changed. Every part of your life was controlled. We were told who to talk to, how to think, and what not to question." "What happened when people did question?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering to Moore for just a split second. He returned her gaze with a cold, calculating stare. Finally she swallowed and looked back at the prosecutor. "They disappeared," she said softly, "or their lives were destroyed." The jury was riveted, the gallery holding its collective breath. "Loose threads," Sarah continued. "Jacob Moore would call them loose threads. Andrew Tate would handle it, but we all knew what it meant." "And was Daniel Harper one of those loose threads?" the prosecutor pressed. Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but her voice didn't waver. "Yes, he saw through everything. He told me he was leaving, but—" She stopped, gripping the back of her chair for support. "He never got the chance." The defense crumbles behind the defense table. Jacob Moore looked unbothered. But his lawyer, an arrogant man with a reputation for defending billionaires, was visibly sweating. The prosecution had built a meticulous case, and with Leah Sanders and Sarah Jennings both testifying, the house of cards Moore had relied upon for years was collapsing. By the time the prosecution called their next witness, Agent Mark Delaney, to discuss the financial evidence provided by Leah, Moore's composure finally cracked. His jaw tightened as the agent explained the web of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and fraudulent transactions that underpin the alliance's so-called wealth. "We traced the money back to Jacob Moore through a series of payments authorized by Mia Caldwell," Delaney testified. Her personal computer, retrieved during the raid, contained encrypted ledgers detailing the scams. These documents also outlined payments made to individuals who enforced the organization's rules, including Andrew Tate. "And you're saying these payments coincide with the disappearance of Daniel Harper?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Delaney confirmed. "A significant sum of money was transferred directly to Tate 3 days after Mr. Harper was last seen alive." The moment of truth. When it came time for Jacob Moore to testify, the courtroom seemed to collectively lean forward. Despite overwhelming evidence, Moore walked to the stand with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. By now, it wasn't surprising. Confidence had always been his weapon of choice. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Mr. Moore, you've heard the testimony from your former accountant, Miss Sanders, and your former recruit, Miss Jennings. Both claim you orchestrated the death of Daniel Harper. Do you deny this?" Moore smirked. "Absolutely. These women are liars. They're bitter. I had nothing to do with Daniel's disappearance." "Nothing?" the prosecutor shot back. "Yet your enforcer, Andrew Tate, was paid a significant sum just days after Harper went missing. Care to explain that?" "Andrew was compensated for work," Moore said coolly. "Legitimate work managing security." "And what about the encrypted ledgers found on Mia Caldwell's computer?" the prosecutor pressed. "Ledgers linking you to illegal transactions, tax fraud, and payments for what you called corrective action?" Moore's smirk wavered for the first time. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" The prosecutor stepped closer, holding up printed copies of the ledgers. "These documents spell it out in black and white. Loose threads to be handled. Those are your words, Mr. Moore, or do you deny authorizing the payments for Daniel Harper's murder?" For a moment Moore stared at her, his silence deafening. The room felt charged, like the courtroom itself was holding its breath. Finally, Moore leaned back, his expression hard. "This is all a witch hunt. You'll never prove anything." The verdict. In the end, it didn't matter how much bravado Moore displayed. The evidence was airtight, the testimonies unshakable. After weeks of trial, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all charges. Jacob Moore, Andrew Tate, and Mia Caldwell were each sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. For the survivors, it was vindication, but also a sobering reminder of what had been lost. As Mathis and his team walked out of the courthouse that day, the weight of the victory settled in. Grayson glanced at the sheriff and gave him a rare smile. "Well, Doug," he said, "looks like we brought down the house." Mathis nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just about bringing them down. It's about making sure none of this ever happens again." Rogers chimed in. "It was justice for Daniel, and for every other person they hurt." She paused. Think his family will finally feel like they have answers? Mathis sighed. Maybe, but no verdict is going to bring him back. What we can do, he straightened his shoulders, is make damn sure no one else ends up like he did. And with that, the three of them left the courthouse, ready to return to the work that never seemed to end. The unforeseen consequences. The verdicts were handed down, the courtroom cleared, and the Ascension Alliance's leaders were hauled off to serve life sentences. From an outsider's viewpoint, it seemed like the horrific saga had come to a fitting resolution. Justice had been served, and the mastermind Jacob Moore, along with his enforcer Andrew Tate and financial manipulator Mia Caldwell, would never manipulate or harm another soul again. But for Sheriff Doug Mathis, Deputy Claire Rogers, and Detective Tom Grayson, life didn't move on so easily. The collapse of an empire like the Ascension Alliance was a seismic event, and like any earthquake, it left a trail of aftershocks. The ripples of chaos, guilt, mourning, and unfinished business stretched far beyond the confines of Boone County's courthouse. The families of the forgotten. Not long after the trial concluded, Mathis received a call at his office. It was from a man in Ohio, his voice trembling as he introduced himself, desperate for answers. I saw Jacob Moore's face on the news. The trial. What you all did. There was a long pause before the voice cracked with restrained emotion. Was he responsible for more than what came out in court? My daughter, Morgan, she disappeared in 2011. Left a note saying she was joining some business group. We never heard from her again. Mathis closed his eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly. This wasn't the first call like this. Since the news of the Alliance's takedown had become public, phone lines at the department had been flooded. Families from all over the country, desperate parents, siblings, even old friends, had started to connect the dots between their missing loved ones and the cult-like multi-level scheme they'd seen on TV. I'm sorry for your loss, Mathis said gently, fumbling for the right words. I can't guarantee we'll have answers, but send me everything you've got. Photos, timelines, anything. We'll look into it. By the end of the week, the stack of missing and unidentified persons linked to Ascension Alliance grew to more than 50 names. Some were recruits who had simply vanished, their tracks carefully erased by Moore's meticulous organization. Others were members who'd tried to leave, their names whispered by survivors like Leah Sanders and Sarah Jennings during off-the-record conversations. It keeps piling up, Rogers murmured one late evening, a thick file of new cold cases spread out before her on the desk. How many lives did Moore destroy, Doug? 5, 50? Hell, it's probably 100, and we'll only ever know about a fraction of them. Mathis leaned over her shoulder, looking at the faces in the photographs. Young, hopeful people who had disappeared into the black hole Moore created. The weight of the task ahead settled heavily on his chest. We made a dent, he said quietly, but this isn't over. Not yet. The survivors' struggles. For those who had managed to escape the Alliance's grip, the ordeal wasn't over upon Moore's arrest. Survivors like Sarah Jennings were thrust into an entirely new battle, rebuilding their lives from the wreckage. Reporters from across the country clamored for interviews, often hounding the most vulnerable survivors and their families. Tabloids ran lurid headlines like "Inside the Cult of Wealth and Death," with sensationalized recreations of Moore's chilling operations. At first, Sarah tried to ignore the flood of attention, but the guilt ate away at her every time she turned on the news or heard her name whispered in public spaces. Eventually, she scheduled a private meeting with Mathis. "You don't understand," Sarah said, voice trembling as she stared down at the table. "I recruited Daniel. I brought him into that hell, and then I ran when he needed me most." Mathis regarded her carefully, his tone measured. "And then you came forward, Sarah. You helped bring Moore down. You've done more than most people would ever have the strength to do." She wiped her tear-streaked face, her voice breaking. "It doesn't make it right. His parents, his friends, they'll never forgive me." "It's not about them forgiving you," Mathis said, softly but firmly. "It's about you forgiving yourself. Guilt's a trap, Sarah. Don't let it take you back to where Moore wanted you, thinking you're powerless." But Sarah was far from the only one struggling. Many former members still held on to the Alliance's promises, their blind loyalty to Moore unbroken, even as he rotted away in prison. Others were haunted by their experiences, unable to regain their footing in the real world after years spent isolated from friends and family. Media frenzy and public outcry. The media firestorm surrounding the Ascension Alliance case was like gasoline poured onto an already raging inferno. National news networks devoted endless airtime to dissecting every facet of the trial, the courtroom confrontations, the victims' stories, even speculative debates over the psychology of Moore's followers. Talking heads labeled him everything from a manipulative cult leader to a modern-day Charles Ponzi. Morning shows invited financial analysts to weigh in on the fragile psychology exploited by multi-level marketing schemes. Public outcry spurred renewed scrutiny of recruitment platforms both on and offline. "People love to simplify things," Grayson muttered during a rare moment of downtime, watching a TV panel debate over Ascension Alliance's methods. "They call it a cult. They call him a scam artist, like slapping a label on it somehow makes it all make sense." "It wasn't just a scam," Rogers said. "It was systematic destruction. People believed in him. They thought he was giving them a way out. He didn't just take their money, he took their hope." Jacob Moore's lingering shadow. Even behind bars, Jacob Moore's influence lingered like a ghost. Despite the damning evidence, the high-profile testimonies, and the guilty verdicts, there were those who still refused to believe in his guilt. An unofficial online network of loyalists, calling themselves the Ascended Coalition, began circulating conspiracy theories. Some claimed Moore had been framed by the government, while others cast him as a misunderstood visionary who had been vilified for challenging the system. Mathis received anonymous tips about former Alliance members hosting secret meetings in defiance of the arrests, some of them still honoring Moore like a martyr for their twisted cause. "It's like chopping the head off a snake," Grayson said bitterly. "The body's still twitching." "And it'll keep twitching," Mathis replied, his jaw set. "But that doesn't mean we let it slither back into another hole." The domino effect. While the Alliance's downfall had been swift and decisive in Boone County's courtroom, it sent shockwaves across the nation. Similar investigations were launched into smaller wealth-building groups and fraudulent schemes in other states. Lawmakers began drafting stricter legislation to regulate multi-level marketing practices and improve protections for vulnerable recruits. Families of missing victims continued to come forward, spurred by the courage of people like Leah Sanders and Sarah Jennings. Some joined advocacy groups to keep the pressure on law enforcement and raise awareness about the dangers of schemes like Ascension Alliance. For Mathis, it felt like the work would never truly stop. Every case file tied to another missing person, every anguished phone call from a desperate family, every news story dissecting the Alliance's aftermath was a reminder of just how far the ripples of Moore's crimes had spread. A bitter reminder. One afternoon, Mathis returned to the quiet waters of Mark Twain Lake, the site of Daniel Harper's discovery years earlier. The lake was calm, reflecting the sky with perfect clarity, a sharp contrast to the horrors it had hidden that August day. "Life goes on," he murmured to himself, the weight of everything hanging heavily in his chest. But as he glanced at the water, undisturbed, eternal, he realized something else. Justice was only one part of the story. The rest was up to those left behind. Lessons and awakening. The end of the Ascension Alliance case wasn't a moment of triumphant finality. It was a ripple effect that sent shockwaves across communities, institutions, and individuals nationwide. It was as if the takedown of Jacob Moore's empire had pulled back a curtain that revealed a far more pervasive and insidious pattern: how easily manipulation could flourish under the guise of hope, success, and belonging. For Sheriff Doug Mathis, Deputy Claire Rogers, and Detective Tom Grayson, the case left haunting memories and heavy lessons. But it wasn't just about the justice they had fought so hard to achieve. It was about asking the bigger questions. How did this happen in the first place? What could be done to stop it from happening again? A wake-up call to communities. Not long after the trial concluded, Mathis found himself standing before a packed auditorium in Jefferson City. Law enforcement officers, social workers, and community leaders had convened for a statewide summit on combating recruitment schemes and cult-like organizations. Mathis wasn't used to public speaking, but this time he knew the stakes. He gripped the edges of the podium, his voice steady as he said, "We thought crime like this only happened in the movies. Charismatic leaders preying on the weak, promising them wealth and salvation. We told ourselves, not our town, not our people. And yet the Ascension Alliance thrived under our noses for years. People were dying, disappearing, and we didn't connect the dots." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "Jacob Moore didn't just manipulate people with money," Mathis continued. "He manipulated them with fear, with promises, with desperation. And the terrifying truth is, there are other Jacob Moores out there right now in our schools, in our churches, in our businesses. People looking for cracks in the system to exploit. And it's up to all of us to stop them." The applause that followed wasn't a cheer. It was somber agreement, a recognition of how much work was left to do. Lessons for law enforcement. For the Boone County Sheriff's Office, the Ascension Alliance case became a mandatory topic of training for new recruits. Grayson, in his usual blunt style, stood at the front of the classroom during one of the sessions, scribbling the words, "How not to miss the signs" on the chalkboard in large capital letters. "This case taught us one big thing," Grayson said, pacing in front of the rookies like a coach delivering halftime instructions. "It's that the victims don't always wear a sign that says, 'Help me.'" Do you think Daniel Harper ever walked into our office begging us to save him from Jacob Moore? No. He didn't even know he was in danger until it was too late. He pointed his finger at a young officer in the front row. Scams like this, they thrive on isolation. They pick their targets carefully, someone drowning in debt, someone lonely, someone who just lost their job or feels like they're running out of time to make something of themselves, and they convince these people to trust them, not us, not their families, them. Rogers, leaning against the back wall, chimed in. "This wasn't your average pyramid scheme. It was psychological warfare. You need to learn to dig deeper. If someone reports what looks like a minor scam, don't dismiss it. Ask questions. Look for patterns. Stay alert. Because you might just uncover the next Jacob Moore before he ruins more lives." Resilience of survivors. While law enforcement adapted to the lessons learned, the survivors of the Ascension Alliance faced their own battle. A journey to reclaim control of their lives. Leah Sanders, the whistleblower whose testimony had been instrumental to the case, had become an unintentional voice for victims of exploitation. She hadn't chosen this role, but as more survivors reached out to her sharing similar stories, she felt compelled to act. "We need to keep talking about it," Leah said during a televised interview on a popular news show. Her voice held newfound strength, though there was still pain in her eyes. "If we pretend it's over, people will stop paying attention. And Jacob Moore's legacy, what he built, what he destroyed, will happen again, just under a different name with a different leader." Sarah Jennings, too, had found her way forward. At first, she avoided the spotlight, focusing on therapy and reconnecting with the family and friends she had distanced herself from during her time in the Alliance. But slowly, she realized her story could help others. In one particularly emotional moment at a survivor support group, Sarah stood up to share. "I didn't see myself as a victim for a long time," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought I was strong, independent, that I couldn't be manipulated. But being strong doesn't make you immune to loneliness. Doesn't make you immune to wanting something more for your life. That's what they took advantage of." The room nodded in quiet understanding as she finished. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that asking for help is not weakness. It's strength. I just wish Daniel had known that too." A Nation Reflects. In the months following the trial, discussions surrounding multi-level marketing schemes and predatory recruitment practices dominated headlines and policymaker debates. Advocacy groups formed almost overnight, demanding stricter regulations and stronger protections for vulnerable individuals. One particularly passionate speech came from a surviving member who had testified anonymously during the trial. Standing before Congress during a hearing on exploitative organizations, the woman said, "They sold us dreams. We lost everything, our money, our sense of self, and for some of us, even our lives. What we need now is action. How many Daniels will it take before you realize this isn't just business? It's abuse." The Ascension Alliance case became a public reckoning, not just about Moore's crimes but about the broader cultural landscape that allowed schemes like his to flourish unchecked. Universities began offering seminars on recognizing coercive tactics, while social media platforms implemented stricter policies to monitor suspicious recruitment activities. Personal reflections. For Sheriff Mathis, the case was personal. He kept a photograph of Daniel Harper pinned to the board above his desk, a quiet reminder of why he'd entered law enforcement in the first place. One evening, as he stared at the fading image, Rogers walked into his office. She dropped a fresh stack of files onto his desk, her expression grim but familiar. "More calls," she said softly. "Families with missing kids, saying they think this might be connected to Moore's gang." Mathis sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Years of this, Claire. This case never really ends, does it?" She gave him a knowing look, then gestured to the photo behind him. "Maybe not, but it's not about it ending, is it? It's about making sure no one else winds up like him." Mathis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he swiveled his chair around to look at the photo. After a moment, he nodded. "Damn right it is." An unfinished mission. The victory over Jacob Moore was monumental, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater, a wake-up call to a society that had grown too complacent. A lesson in the vulnerabilities that manipulation could exploit, and a reminder that for every battle won, there were countless others waiting to be fought. Mathis, Rogers, and Grayson carried those lessons with them, not as a burden, but as a purpose. And though new challenges lay ahead, one thing was certain: the legacy